Imagine a man standing in the twilight of the Appalachian mountains. A shotgun roars, and the buckshot tears through the air, striking him square in the face. But the man doesn't fall. He doesn't even scream. He simply spits the lead pellets onto the ground as if they were cherry pits, a cold grin spreading across his face. This wasn't a scene from a movie. This was the reality for those who dared to cross Taly Iron Jaws Hall. The whispers in Wise County said he was more than a man. They said he was enchanted, that bullets couldn't kill him. But was he a demon born of mountain folklore? Or was the truth something far stranger, something hidden in the very marrow of his bones? Today, we separate the legend from the man to find out what really made Taly Hall the bandit who couldn't be killed. To understand the man, you must first understand the mountains that made him. In the late 19th century, Wise County, Virginia, was a world unto itself. It was a labyrinth of steep hollers, dense forests, and rushing creeks where the outside world felt a million miles away. The land was both a provider and a tyrant. It gave families corn from the bottomlands and game from the woods, but it demanded back-breaking work in return. Life here was simple, hard, and governed by unwritten laws older than any courthouse. Family was everything, and an insult to your kin was an insult to you. In this world, Mabra Taly Hall was born. He wasn't born a monster or a legend. He was just another mountain boy, learning the ways of his people. And in these parts, the most important craft, the very lifeblood of the local economy, was turning corn into whiskey. Moonshining wasn't seen as a crime by many. It was a tradition, a skill passed from father to son. It was how you turned a surplus crop into cash, how you paid for medicine, tools, or a piece of land to call your own. Taly learned the trade early, mastering the art of the still, understanding the subtle science of fermentation and distillation under the dark Appalachian night. He was a big man, powerfully built from a life of hard labor. People knew him as strong, quiet, and fiercely protective of his own. He worked his still, provided for his family, and lived by the mountain code. In these early days, he was just a distiller, respected for the quality of his product. He was part of a community of others just like him, men who saw the federal government's whiskey tax not as a law to be obeyed, but as an intrusion by a foreign power trying to steal the bread from their tables. The conflict wasn't just about money, it was about pride and independence. The people of these mountains had always taken care of themselves. They built their own homes, grew their own food, and settled their own disputes. The arrival of federal marshals, the revenuers, was seen as a declaration of war on their entire way of life. These outsiders didn't understand the mountains or the people who lived in them. They saw moonshiners as simple criminals, not as farmers and family men trying to survive. And in this simmering tension, the seeds of Taly Hall's future were sown. He wasn't just making whiskey, he was making a stand. Every barrel he sold was an act of defiance. But this quiet rebellion couldn't last forever. The government was determined to enforce its laws, and men like Taly were just as determined to resist. The calm of the mountains was about to be shattered by the crack of rifles, and a simple moonshiner named Taly Hall would soon be forced to become something far more dangerous to survive. The world was coming for him, and it would learn that he would not be taken easily. The law came for Taly Hall not with a polite knock, but with the splintering of wood and the cold gleam of rifle barrels. It happened on a misty morning, deep in a holler where the smell of sour mash hung heavy in the air. Taly was working his still with his brother when two federal marshals, led by a man named Red Blevins, crashed through the undergrowth. They weren't there to talk, they were there to make an example. With a sneer, Blevins kicked over a barrel of fermenting corn, the lifeblood of the Hall family business spilling into the dirt. For a mountain man, this was more than the destruction of property. It was a profound insult, a strike against his pride and his ability to provide. Taly stood frozen for a moment, his massive hands clenched into fists. He didn't say a word. According to the stories passed down, Marshal Blevins then raised his axe, not to the still itself, but to the worm, the delicate copper coil that was the heart of the operation. As the axe came down, something inside Taly Hall snapped. The quiet distiller was gone, and in his place stood something far more primal. What happened next became the first chapter of his legend. Taly didn't reach for a gun. He lunged forward, moving with a speed that was terrifying in a man his size. He met the marshals not with bullets, but with bone and sinew. He broke one man's arm with a single brutal twist and sent the other flying with a blow to the chest that knocked the wind clean out of him. Red Blevins, the leader, found himself lifted off the ground by his throat, staring into eyes that held no mercy. Taly didn't kill him. He simply threw him down the hillside like a sack of grain, leaving him broken and humiliated. The marshals limped back to the town of Wise, carrying with them not just bruises and broken bones, but a story of a man who fought like a cornered bear. The line had been crossed. This was no longer about an unpaid tax. Taly Hall had assaulted federal officers. A warrant was issued for his arrest, and his name was no longer just whispered among moonshiners. It was now spoken with fear and anger in the courthouse. He was officially a fugitive, a wanted man with a price on his head. Taly knew what this meant. There was no going back. He couldn't return to a quiet life. He had stood his ground, and now the full weight of the law was coming for him. But instead of running, he dug in. He gathered his brothers and his kin, men who believed in the same code he did. The forest that had been his workshop now became his fortress. The first drops of blood had been shed, not by Taly, but by the government's attempt to break him. And Taly Hall had answered in the only language he knew they would understand. The war had begun. With a price on his head, Taly Hall became the most hunted man in Wise County. But hunting him and catching him were two very different things. The mountains were his kingdom, and he moved through them like a ghost. This drove his rivals, other moonshiners whose business he had crushed with his own brand of violent enforcement, to a point of desperation. They decided to do what the law couldn't. They set a trap on the Pound Gap, a treacherous road that snaked through the mountains, a place where a man could disappear without a trace. They waited in the deep shadows as Taly rode alone, a silhouette against the rising moon. As he passed a narrow bend, the night erupted. A shotgun blast, fired from less than 20 feet away, struck him full in the head and upper body. The sound echoed through the holler, a deafening roar that sent birds scattering from the trees. Taly's horse shrieked and crumpled to the ground, its legs tangled in a dying heap. The ambushers stepped out from their cover, rifles ready, expecting to see a body. But Taly Hall was still standing. He swayed on his feet, stunned by the impact, but he did not fall. The men watched in frozen disbelief as he slowly raised a hand to his face. There was a strange, gravelly sound, and then he spat something dark onto a broadleaf plant on the roadside. He did it again and again. The moonlight caught the objects, and the attackers felt a cold dread creep up their spines. They were lead pellets. Buckshot. He was spitting the bullets out of his own flesh. It was in this moment that the man died, and the legend was born. The attackers weren't looking at a moonshiner anymore. They were looking at something torn from the pages of a dark folk tale, a creature the mountains themselves had made. He took a step towards them, his face a mask of cold fury. One of the men, shaking with fear, raised his rifle and fired again. The bullet slammed into Taly's chest with a sickening thud, a sound like a hammer hitting stone. It barely staggered him. The sounds that followed were not of gunfire. They were the sounds of snapping wood as Taly ripped a rifle from one man's hands and broke it over his knee like a twig. They were the dull, heavy thuds of fists meeting flesh, followed by choked-off cries of pain. He didn't use a gun. He didn't need to. He moved among them like a storm, and when the terrible, frantic noise was over, only silence remained. He left the men broken and scattered on that lonely road, a living testament to his unnatural resilience. From that night on, he was no longer just Taly Hall. He was Iron Jaws Hall. The story spread like wildfire, carried on hushed whispers from one holler to the next. They said he was protected by a witch, that he had made a pact with the devil. The truth, doctors would speculate many years later, may have been a rare medical condition called Paget's disease, which causes bones to become abnormally thick and dense, essentially creating a form of natural armor. But in the dark woods of Wise County, no one cared about a medical diagnosis. The only truth that mattered was the one they saw with their own eyes and heard in the terrified tales of the survivors. Taly Hall was enchanted. He was bulletproof, and if you shot him, you had better pray you killed him with the first shot, because you would not get a second. The silence that fell over Pound Gap after the failed ambush was deeper and more terrifying than the roar of the shotgun that had started it. The broken men who dragged themselves back to civilization did not speak of a botched attack. They spoke of a nightmare. They told a story not of a fight, but of an encounter with something inhuman, something that ate lead and paid it back with crushing force. Their words, laced with genuine terror, were far more potent than any rumor. The legend of Iron Jaws Hall was no longer a whispered bit of folklore. It was now a sworn testimony, sealed in fear. Taly Hall himself seemed to understand the power of what had happened. He didn't retreat deeper into the mountains. Instead, he did the opposite. He became more visible, more brazen. He knew that fear was a more effective weapon than any rifle. His reputation preceded him, a silent, invisible guard that cleared his path. Other moonshiners, men who had once been his rivals, now fell in line. They either paid him a tribute to operate, a tax of their own, or they got out of the business entirely. To defy Taly was to challenge a man who bullets supposedly couldn't harm. No one was willing to take that chance. The authorities were now faced with an impossible situation. The reward for Taly's capture was increased, becoming a small fortune for the time. But money meant nothing against superstition. Deputies who were brave enough to face a dozen armed men would hesitate at the thought of confronting Taly Hall alone. Informants dried up, their fear of the law replaced by a much more primal fear of iron jaws. The manhunt, once an active pursuit, became a cold case file gathering dust on a shelf. They were hunting a ghost who was very much alive, a man who ruled a shadow empire from the heart of their jurisdiction. The community became a landscape of fear and fascination. On one hand, Taly was a boogeyman. People would lock their doors a little tighter at night, and his name was used to frighten misbehaving children. He was the embodiment of the violence and lawlessness that festered in the deep woods. But on the other hand, a quiet, grudging respect grew for him in some corners. He was a mountain man, one of their own, who was single-handedly defying the federal government and winning. He was a symbol, however dark, of Appalachian grit and refusal to bow down. The ashes of that ambush on Pound Gap were not from a fire, but from the smouldering ruin of Taly Hall's mortality. What was left was a silence born of pure dread. He had become the undisputed king of the Wise County underworld, not just a criminal, but a living legend whose power was rooted in the belief that he could not be killed by ordinary means. The law was powerless, his rivals were terrified, and Taly Iron Jaws Hall walked the mountains not as a fugitive, but as a conqueror. Taly Iron Jaws Hall never stood trial in a courthouse. He was never made to sit on a hard wooden bench and listen to lawyers argue over his fate. The law of men, with its warrants, judges and juries, proved utterly powerless against him. His trial was a rolling, years-long affair, held in the dark hollers and on the treacherous mountain roads. The prosecuting attorneys were the bounty hunters and federal marshals who came for him, and the evidence they presented was the buckshot and rifle slugs they fired his way. The bounty on his head grew to be a legendary sum, drawing daring men from neighboring states. They came with new rifles and hardened resolve, dreaming of the fame and fortune that would come from bringing in Iron Jaw's haul. They formed posses, laid intricate traps, and combed the mountains, convinced they would succeed where others had failed. They were, in effect, a traveling court, come to Wise County to deliver a sentence. But Taly Hall was his own defense attorney, and his arguments were brutally effective. One by one, the posses were outsmarted, the traps were sidestepped, and the bounty hunters were met with a terrifying response. Some were found beaten near to death, left as a warning on the side of a road. Others simply vanished into the woods, never to be seen again. The verdict in each of these violent encounters was the same. Taly Hall walked away. He was judged by the laws of survival, and in that court he was consistently found innocent by virtue of being the last man standing. This was not justice, it was dominance. Taly had replaced the law of the land with his own law of fear. But the justice of the mountains is a patient, cruel thing. For every man he intimidated, he created an enemy. For every family he terrorized, he sowed the seeds of a future reckoning. His invincibility had made him arrogant, and he had forgotten the most fundamental rule of his world. There is always someone tougher, someone more desperate, or someone with a better aim. The final trial came without warning. A lawman, some say a deputy named Doc Swindle, decided the only way to stop a legend was to meet it head-on. He didn't come with a warrant. He came with a rifle and a resolve as hard as the mountain stone. He hunted Taly not as a lawman pursuing a criminal, but as a predator stalking its prey. He found him on a lonely path, and there was no talk, no chance to surrender. The air cracked with the sound of a single, well-aimed shot. This time, Iron Jaws fell. He hit the dirt, and this time he did not get back up. The bullet, they say, was special. Some claim it was silver, others that it was filled with mercury, designed to overcome whatever magic protected him. But whether it was magic or lead, the verdict was finally in. Taly Hall was guilty, and the sentence was death. It was a verdict delivered not by a jury, but by a lone gunman, and it raises the ultimate question. Was this the law of men at last catching its fugitive? Or was it simply the brutal, unforgiving justice of the mountains finally claiming one of its own? Taly Iron Jaws Hall was buried in a small, remote cemetery in Wise County, not far from the lands he once ruled. For years, his grave was marked only by a simple fieldstone, as if even in death, people were afraid to carve his name for fear of what it might conjure. Today, a more formal headstone stands, a silent testament to the man who was once a living terror. Local historians and descendants still visit, standing over the patch of earth that finally managed to hold him, and they wonder. The physical landscape has changed. Pound Gap is no longer a treacherous dirt track, but a paved highway, US Route 23, that carries thousands of cars a day. Commuters and truckers speed through the cut in the mountain, their minds on schedules and destinations, completely unaware that they are passing through the very spot where a man once stood and spat buckshot back at his would-be killers. But for those who know the story, a drive through the gap, especially as evening falls, feels different. The shadows seem deeper, and the wind whistling through the rocks sounds like a whisper from the past. The legend of Iron Jaws has outlived the man by more than a century. It survives in the oral traditions of Appalachia, a story told by grandparents to their grandchildren, a campfire tale that happens to be true. While modern science offers a plausible explanation in the form of Paget's disease, that dry medical term has none of the power or romance of the legend. In the mountains, the story of the enchanted moonshiner who couldn't be killed by bullets remains the preferred version. It speaks to a deeper truth about the region, a belief in the extraordinary, and a deep-seated suspicion of simple explanations. The name Hall still echoes through Wise County and the surrounding region. The descendants carry not just the name, but the complex legacy of their infamous ancestor. For some, it's a dark chapter best forgotten, a stain of violence on the family history. For others, it's a source of a strange, defiant pride, a reminder of an ancestor who refused to bow to anyone, who was a king in his own right, however brutal his reign. The story hasn't vanished. It's simply gone underground, living on in family Bibles and hushed conversations. The mountains remember everything, and the shadow of Taly Iron Jaws Hall is a long one. So we come back to the question that hung in the air at the start of our journey. Was Taly Iron Jaws Hall truly enchanted by bullets? The logical mind points to science, to the rare bone disease that likely turned his skull and ribs into a natural, horrifying armor. And perhaps that is the simple, factual truth. But in the mountains, the truth is rarely simple. The real magic wasn't in his bones, it was in the power of belief. His legend became a weapon more potent than any gun, a shield more effective than any steel plate. The fear he created was so real, so absolute, that it may as well have been a genuine enchantment. This is a story that goes beyond a simple tale of a mountain outlaw. It is a raw and brutal lesson about the soul of Appalachia itself. It's a story about the fierce, untamable spirit of independence, but also a dark warning of what that spirit can become when it's stripped of its humanity. Taly Hall began as a man defending his way of life, a symbol of resistance against an outside world he didn't trust. But in his war against the law, he became a tyrant far more terrifying than any government agent, a monster who preyed on his own people. He is the ultimate Appalachian paradox, a folk hero and a villain forged in the same fire. The story of Iron Jaws teaches us that some legends are born not from fantasy, but from a truth so strange it has to be seen to be believed. He was a man of flesh and blood, but he became something more, an idea, a nightmare, a force of nature. Force. He walked the earth for a time, a king in a kingdom of shadows and fear, until the mountains that created him finally took him back. His name is now a whisper on the wind, a reminder that the old, wild magic of these hills has not entirely faded. And now, my friends, you know the rest of the story.